Alright folks, this is Harris Sultan, and I thought I'd throw in my 10 cents on the recent controversy raging on British social media, started by none other than our very own Konstantin Kisin. He sparked a debate about the label English. Who deserves to be called English, and who doesn't? But this controversy escalated when Suella Braverman chimed in, saying, "I'm a proud British Asian, and of course, I'm not English. I never thought that was contentious." But then I saw the exchange between Fraser Nelson and Konstantin Kisin on TriggerPod and realized that too many people are nervous about asserting English identity for what it is: ethnic, racial, and based on ancestry. If we can't even agree on who the English are, how on earth are we ever going to defend the culture and values of this country? My thoughts in today's column in Telegraph. Now, in my opinion, England is a country that has historically opened itself up to people from different cultures and racial backgrounds, allowing them to come in, build a life, and integrate into English society. That's why, in my opinion, England, along with other multi-ethnic societies, is considered a higher form of society, one that is further along the evolutionary ladder of civilization. And speaking of evolution, one of the things I keep coming across, whether it's in books, podcasts, or just listening to experts, is how much control we actually have over aging. It's not just about genetics, it's about what we do with our bodies. Take someone like Joe Rogan. He's in his late 50s, but the guy still trains like a beast, keeps up with fighters, and has insane energy levels. One of the supplements he talked about is NMN, which has been making waves in the health and longevity space. But rather than me explaining it, here's the scientist who helped discover it, breaking it down for you.
What is NMN?
Good question. So about 20 years ago, Lenny Guarente and a team of us at MIT discovered a set of genes that controls aging in yeast cells, just brewer's yeast, what you find in beer and bread. And those genes are called sirtuins, and there are 7 of them in our bodies, 5 in yeast. And what they do is they protect all organisms on the planet, plants, bacteria, humans, from deterioration and disease. They're like the Pentagon. They sense when we're hungry, sense when we're exercising, and they send out the troops to defend us. So when you put more of these genes into a yeast cell or a mouse, they'll live longer, between 5 to 20% longer. And so we think that these genes are responsible for the effects of dieting and exercise, which is great. What that means is we can now mimic that with molecules. So NMN is one of those molecules, so is resveratrol.
Let's be real. As guys, we want to stay sharp, stay strong, and feel good in our own skin, because no one is going to do that for us. That's where today's sponsor comes in, Black Forest Supplements NMN. They've got a high-quality NMN supplement that helps kickstart that NAD plus production, and for the next 48 hours, they're running a buy 2, get 1 free deal. If you've been thinking about optimizing your health, this might be something worth checking out. Links in the description and pinned comment below. Now let's get back to the discussion. So, why is it that the same people who insist that being English requires certain racial traits conveniently drop that logic when it comes to being British? Why is British identity not tied to racial traits, even though the native Welsh, Scots, and English are all white? Now let's clarify something. Britain is a collection of isles, including England, Scotland, and Wales. Britain functions as a single entity composed of multiple nations, which is why these identity labels can get a bit tricky. Northern Ireland, while not part of Britain, is part of the United Kingdom, who, by the way, adopt various identities. There is no single identity. Unionists consider themselves British, even though they're outside of the British Isles. Nationalists consider themselves Irish, and some identify as both. So when Suella Braverman says she's British Indian, she's essentially saying that she belongs to the whole island of Britain, but not exclusively to England, even though she was born and raised in England. That's why, in multi-ethnic societies, labels that should be cultural but instead become ethnic are a recipe for disaster. Throughout this video, my argument will revolve around this premise. If people who are not ethnically native Britons can be called British, then why can't people in England who are not ethnically native English be called English? The conclusion of my argument is that being English in the modern world is a cultural identity rather than a racial one. So let's have a look at what Konstantin is kissing.
Oh no, I did a racism. One of the things that anyone who attempts to speak their mind in public knows is that there is nothing more dangerous than making a statement of the bleeding obvious. However, since trigonometry is about having honest conversations, I frequently forget this and say exactly what I and millions of others think without filtering everything to avoid getting in trouble. Last week, this resulted in shock and outrage when in a discussion with Fraser Nelson about the difference between being British and being English, I dared to suggest that Rishi Sunak was British, but not English. Here's a flavour of what was said, but you can watch the entire 7-minute discussion on our channel. I've always said, this is a very unpopular thing, that I'm not English, I will never be English. I don't think Rishi Sunak is English. We're both British, but we're not English.
No, you weren't born here, you were an immigrant.
No, but my son was born here. I don't think my son is English.
Some people make this point by saying that if a dog is born in a stable, it doesn't become a horse. I think the argument being made here is that the label English is tied to racial or ethnic traits. But let's be clear, this makes it a racist argument. That doesn't mean the person making it is a racist. It simply means the argument itself is based on race. And by the way, I don't even think that all racist arguments are inherently bad. We know that certain ethnicities are more susceptible to specific diseases purely for biological reasons. For example, people of African descent are more prone to sickle cell anemia, while people of European descent have a higher likelihood of cystic fibrosis. At some point, a race-based argument had to be made to recognize these differences, which ultimately led doctors and scientists to develop and prescribe treatments tailored to different ethnic groups. So no, making a racist argument in itself is not inherently evil, despite what the modern far left might claim. Therefore, this argument is racist because it bases its premise on the race of the subject, but not some evil exercise.
I would say that Rishi Sunak is as English as Tizer and Y-fronts, right? He is absolutely English. He was born and bred here. And I wouldn't say that the colour of his skin makes him any
He's
less.
a brown Hindu. How is he English?
Because he's born and bred here.
So by being born here, you become English, in your opinion?
Yeah.
I'll actually add a few more prerequisites to this. If you're born in England, you're proud of being English, you adopt English values as your core belief system, and you're willing to live and die for England just like any ethnic Englishman, then yes, you are English. And by the way, this isn't some radical new argument. Just replace English with British and suddenly there's no controversy. But I would argue that simply being born in England isn't enough to be considered English or even British for that matter. Human beings are no longer primarily racial creatures. We are ideological creatures. For most of history, race played a major role in protecting human groups because physical differences were easily visible and societies largely operated in isolation. With these differences came negative stereotypes, which only fueled further division. But when you really examine it, people didn't fight because they found others ugly. They fought because they had different cultures, different values, and conflicting worldviews. Now, in the modern world, these differences have been diminished. People intermingle, adopt values that were once foreign to them, and in doing so, we've actually reduced racism. If you ask ethnic English people about non-white individuals who love England and would die to protect it, would they still hate them? I can bet my life on it. The vast majority would say no. They would embrace them. Even some skinheads would say, I don't hate them, but I don't want them in my country. This shows that our historical divisions weren't purely about physical differences, but rather about the values we were willing to fight and die for. This is why I think making an identity label exclusive to a particular ethnicity in a society that many want to belong to is problematic. This argument might have made sense in closed societies like North Korea, China, or even Japan, where they don't open their doors to foreign ethnicities. But isn't that the very opposite of what England hopes for and demands? That the people who come here should integrate, adopt English values, live and die for England, and ultimately see themselves as English. You can't have people willing to die for England when you can't even let them call themselves English.
English, because there's a difference, right?
I don't think English is national. Look, to take, I'm a Scotch, right?
Yeah.
Now, are my kids English? I would say they are.
How?
Because they were born here.
They're Scottish.
Nope.
By blood,
No,
right?
they've hardly ever been to Scotland, unfortunately.
So what?
By blood.
So Fraser actually made a very good point. Now, he's visibly white. His children, I'm assuming, are also white as any other Englishman. Most probably speak with a fancy English accent, barely know anything about Scottish history. They have effectively lived their lives as English. And guess what? 99.99% of English people would have no problem with them seeing as English either, because they can't tell that their parents are Scottish. And even if they could tell them, I don't think they would have had a problem with that. Tommy Robinson, his mum is Irish. Can he call himself English? The poor guy loves England, has risked his life for England, and is rotting away in prison for England. But he can't even call himself English? It's the values you subscribe that make you who you are, not the ethnic part of your DNA. Now, replace Tommy Robinson with some Middle Eastern looking guy who shares exactly the same thoughts as Tommy Robinson. I actually know a lot of them. In fact, most British ex-Muslims are even more hardcore than Tommy Robinson. But sorry, they can't be called English, despite their willing to risk their lives for England. Zayn Malik, arguably the second most handsome Pakistani going around at the moment. Obviously, I'm number one. Can't believe I had to tell you this. He came out as an ex-Muslim a while ago. He said he feels more English than a Muslim or a Pakistani. Faced massive backlash for his comments, but sorry, he can't be English because only his mum is English. See how unfair that is?
I mean,
My son is born to a Russian and a Ukrainian, right? How on earth is he English?
because he was born here.
I think Fraser got stuck on being born in England as the primary prerequisite for being English. But take Constantine's children, for example. They're born and raised in England. And if they see themselves as more English than half Russian, Ukrainian, then who has the right to tell them you can call yourself British, but not English? That's an exclusive racial club you're not welcome in. I know all my cousins who are born and raised in Australia know very little about their Pakistani heritage. And you have a whole generation of people who know nothing about their cultural heritage. My cousins are effectively more Australian than they could ever be Pakistanis. In fact, we even have a word for them, ABCD, which is like American born confused Desi. Desi mean Indian or Pakistani. And you can replace America with Australia or Britain as well. They cop a lot of stick for not being true Pakistanis, but at the same time, they can't even be called English or Australian or American because it's an exclusive racial club. This argument falls apart even further when you look at countries like Australia or Canada. Unlike the United Kingdom, we don't have alternative political labels like British that exist alongside English. So what happens if a Middle Eastern child is born in Australia, fully subscribes to Australian values, has no attachment to their ancestral homeland, and is willing to live and die for Australia just like any other Anglo-Saxon Australian? If they were born in England, yeah, they could call themselves British Middle Eastern. But in Australia, there's no equivalent term. What's the alternative here? Maybe they should call themselves a Commonwealthian? That's not cool. See how ridiculous that sounds?
We're all British. That's fine with me. But pretending that my son is English, what? Come on.
I think this is the crux of the matter. Constantine sees English as an ethnic identity, not a cultural one. But I believe there's far more reasons to argue that English is now a cultural identity rather than an ethnic one. Proponents of the ethnic argument claim that we are being robbed of our identity. By our, they mean only white people should be able to claim England's accomplishments. This argument never sat well with me, even when I think about my own identity as a Pakistani. I'm not responsible for the achievements or crimes of my ancestors, so why should I feel pride or shame for what they did? The same applies to the English today. Most English people acknowledge the darker chapters of their history, but they don't want to be personally judged for what their ancestors did. Are you proud that your ancestors held slaves or colonized the world? No, you can objectively look at history and say, yes, that happened. It was the norm back then, but we've evolved. Today, most of us no longer see other races as inferior, even though, yes, some people still do, but I'm not addressing them. The point is, your values and culture have evolved, and as a result, so has your identity. Just a few centuries ago, an English lord owned serfs. But does anyone today think that English people still own serfs? Of course not. The label English has evolved. Now, I'm not saying you shouldn't be proud of your country, your culture, or your history. You absolutely should. But you shouldn't base that pride solely on ethnicity. Because, as I said, the meaning of English has evolved.
And if you actually do watch the entire thing, you're going to go much further than any of the journalists who decided to be outraged about this, attempting to start a pylon on social media and publishing hyperventing article after hyperventing article on my outrageous views. They reacted instead to a carefully edited 20-second clip in which I appeared to suggest that it is the fact that Rishi Sunak is a brown Hindu that prevents him from being English. So deranged was the reaction that Fraser himself ended up writing an article defending my argument about ethnicity as a perfectly fair point. He himself also copped a lot of flack from those who feel that his view that you become English by simply being born in England is incorrect.
Yeah, look, I think the outrage from both sides was totally unnecessary. People should be allowed to discuss and debate identity labels that have historically been associated with ethnicities. It's a reasonable argument to make, but for the reasons I mentioned earlier, it's not the strongest argument out there.
In case you are one of the dishonest journalists who misunderstood what I said on purpose, let me explain it for you as simply as I can. This is a page from the British Census. Which of these boxes do you think Rishi Sunak ticks?
Just as our values and cultures evolve, so too must the ways we classify and understand them. This form needs to be updated because it incorrectly categorizes several labels as ethnicities or groups when they're not. To be clear, I'm not challenging the existence of ethnicity as a category. Recording people's ethnic backgrounds is important for record keeping, but let's be honest, many individuals born and raised in England still maintain strong allegiances to their ancestral countries. Understanding the ethnic composition of a population isn't just about ethnicity itself, but also about recognizing which cultures are influencing or competing with English culture.
Reason why you have to fight them is because they are Jews and Christians.
Of Birmingham will not tolerate the disrespect of our Prophet, peace be upon him, and there will be outcomes from your actions. You will have repercussions for your actions. We have been trained from birth that we must defend the honor of our Prophet, and we will lay our life on the line.
Therefore, when it comes to ethnicity, white English people should simply identify as white. Labels like Scottish, English, or Welsh have evolved into cultural identities rather than distinct ethnic categories. I guess the wokes did get something right. Identities are in fact fluid. For example, Pakistani is definitely not my identity. Punjabi is my ethnicity, but for all intents and purposes, my national identity is Australia. And I wasn't even born here. My loyalty is with the Australian Constitution, its people, and if I'm forced to fight for it, I'll do it. Begrudgingly, albeit, because life is too good in Australia. What about black Americans? Can they call themselves just Americans rather than having to add prefixes like African or black?
Well, actually, you don't have to think, which is helpful if you're a legacy media journalist, because Rishi Sunak himself has answered this question in the past. Quote, British Indian is what I tick on the census. We have a category for it. I am thoroughly British. This is my home and my country, but my religious and cultural heritage is Indian. My wife is Indian. End quote.
Rishi Sunak can choose whichever label he prefers, but I can still point out some logical inconsistencies in that reasoning. What does he mean by this is my home and my country? Britain is not a country. England is. So why not identify as English Indian instead of just British Indian? And what would happen if Scotland separated from Great Britain? Would you still call yourself British when United Britain no longer exists? That said, I don't believe this debate is solely driven by white people trying to guard the label English. Many individuals from diverse backgrounds also seek to preserve their cultural heritage, kind of like Rishi Sunak, who says I'm a brown Hindu, which is why they might hesitate to fully embrace a foreign identity like English. And that's completely fine. After all, we've already established that identities are fluid. I've gone fully woke.
Far from being racist against himself, Sunak is saying something entirely uncontroversial. As I say in our discussion with Fraser Nelson, my son, born in England to two British parents, is not English either. It's true that someone could be a Hindu and be English. Someone could also have dark skin and be English if they are ethnically English. But we know that Rishi Sunak is neither, and in my exasperation, I used the shortcut of brown Hindu to make the point that he is what we call British Asian.
Okay, so what's the cutoff point? 1% English DNA is enough to make you call yourself English even though you look African? Let's just talk about his practicality. Both of these men are born and raised in England, love England, and equally patriotic. On the left, you have a white man who has zero English DNA, and he's a confirmed Scotsman. On the right, you have a black British, sorry, not calling him an Englishman yet, but has 20% English DNA, and the rest comes from the Caribbean. Hand on heart, who do you think people would find English? Who do you think for the rest of his life will have to keep explaining that I'm an Englishman because I have 20% English DNA, whereas the Scotsman would never have to explain that? Can you imagine the struggles the black Englishman will have to go through his entire life? Can you seriously expect him to remain as steadfastly loyal to England as he was before we applied Constantine's definition?
We don't talk about the English Asian community or the English Muslim community or English Jews or English Sikhs.
Well, that's only because you have another label available, British. But as I said before, what happens if Scotland ceases to be part of Britain? If Britain no longer exists in its current form, would you still call yourself British? That would be stupid. This isn't a logically coherent argument. If we accept British Muslim, British Hindu, British Jew as valid terms, then logically we should also have English Muslims, English Hindus, English Jews, because it maintains the same structural logical consistency. Otherwise, we are applying different rules to different identities without a clear rationale.
It is popular to pretend this isn't true among the white commentariat class, but everyone else, especially ethnic minorities, regards this as a statement of the bleeding obvious.
I'm sorry, but is there a survey that proves most ethnic minorities don't think the English label is right for them? And even if such a survey exists, that wouldn't make the argument valid. Logic isn't democratic. If someone can call themselves British, then by the same reasoning, they should also be able to call themselves English, Welsh, or Scottish. There is no logical basis for treating these identities differently.
Of course, all of this is fuzzy at the edges and highly contextual. A British Asian person could play for the England football team, for example. But that isn't the context of the discussion. The reason we're having this conversation, of course, is that the demographics of Britain have shifted very rapidly in recent decades due to mass immigration. And this creates understandable challenges when it comes to creating a cohesive society that can unite around a shared identity.
United under a common identity? But you're excluding a lot of people. Does uniting under a common identity mean ethnicity? I know for a fact that Constantine is neither a racist nor someone who appeases others, but I don't think he fully realizes what he's saying. And he's a very smart guy. Maybe I'm misunderstanding it. But so far from what I've understood, he's saying only ethnic English people can unite under a common identity, while non-ethnic English people who love England just as much and want to contribute to its progress are left out. I do understand his overall point though. We have many people who call themselves British, yet their loyalties lie elsewhere.
At the time that we're living in today, it's very, very hard to claim that. Imposing onto you, saying that you have to accept the British values. And Muslims are being put in situations where they're asked, are you a Muslim first or are you a British first?
Yeah, but these are easy questions to answer. I'm a Muslim first. Like, what's the issue?
This is why I previously said that we should record people's ethnicities, because it can give us insight into where a person's loyalties might lie. Take British Muslims, for example. Many openly state that they identify as Muslims first and British second. We should absolutely keep a record of that. It provides valuable insights. But all of this can be done without depriving people of the label English who identify as English. Again, this isn't anything radical. It's the same approach already taken with the label British.
The speed with which this has happened is unprecedented. At the time of the first census to record ethnicity, which was conducted in 1991, white British people made up well over 90% of the population. You need only walk around any major British city to see how much this has changed in what is a very short period of time. No amount of lecturing about diversity being our strength can overcome the fact that it is difficult for people from different backgrounds who increasingly don't even speak the same language to have a sense of community and common purpose. We need to have a serious conversation in this country about how we develop an overarching identity that we can all buy into. Pretending we're all English isn't going to cut it.
I agree with everything he said at the end. You're right. People who can't even speak English shouldn't be called English. But by the same logic, they also shouldn't be called British either. These challenges are real. But redefining English as an exclusively ethnic identity isn't gonna cut it. I don't think Constantine is racist, nor do I think he's unintelligent, but his argument, I'm sorry to say, isn't well thought out. And while like me, he's strongly anti-woke, we don't have to reject everything just because it happens to overlap with woke ideology. I'm not sure how many people are gonna like this video, but if you did like it, hit the like button, subscribe button. Also, let me know of your thoughts in the comments below. Until next time, ta-da.